Well, 2023 is coming to a close, and Star Citizen has had a very interesting year. There's been a lot of ups and a lot of downs, and a lot of interesting information that we've gotten at the end of the year. So I want to take a look back from 3.22 to 3.18 and look at everything that we've gotten, as well as some other little tidbits and information we've got in between. Let's begin with the first patch of the year, 3.18, one of the biggest downs. 318 really started last year with Chris Roberts' letter to the chairman. And if you don't know what that is, Chris Roberts, the CEO of CIG, basically usually releases a letter to the chairman addressing a bunch of stuff, talking about future plans at the end of the year. He didn't in 2021 and instead posted in May talking about the road to 4.0, which included persistent entity streaming, the separation of the replication layer from the servers, and eventually server meshing. Basically, PES or persistent entity streaming would allow items to actually stay on the server, which is pretty important for future gameplay, including things like salvage and the new cargo grid system, as well as just actually allowing your choices to feel like they matter when they stay around. At least that was the goal. So 318 had probably one of the longest PTU cycles that I've ever seen. I don't know if it was literally the longest, but it certainly felt like it. I can't remember exactly when it came out, but it came out for non-Evocati players around, I think, September, October, end of the year, I think. And it lasted all the way until March. And it broke everything. I don't think there's been a worse patch for Star Citizen, and I've been around since about 2014. Admittedly, I haven't played every patch, but I've played a decent amount of them. And although there's probably patches with worse performance or patches that haven't had a lot of gameplay, because the game was, I think, kind of fun to play, there was a lot of new mechanics to test out. The fact that so many people literally just couldn't play, like their accounts were bricked until I think even like 3.19, 3.19.1, 3.20, it was a really bad time to start off the year, especially because CIG for some reason decided to advertise this everywhere. They bought a bunch of ads playing 318. They sent out emails to different content creators saying, "Hey, come check out 318." And it broke the entire database. They actually did a post-mortem talking about, which we might look at here. But 318 was more than just, PES and everything broken. Let's actually take a look at some of the features here. I've got both the roadmap and then we're going to browse through the patch notes because sometimes there's important stuff that they, for some reason, don't put on the patch notes. So we got the Daymar crash site. So these were just an additional couple wrecks I think was nice. I haven't really visited them that much, I'm going to be honest, but, more variety. We got the new rivers. Again, cool, as well as the sand caves. These are both like cool planetary tech, but until there's some actual reason to go there, I mean, they're very awesome visuals, and Star Citizen does locations very well, but I would like to see some. I'm not even sure if they've even put gameplay in the sand caves yet. They talked about not having time, and I don't know if they've actually revisited them. We have the Grey Cat PTV racetrack, which was certainly a choice. It doesn't work particularly well, and it's not that fun, I have to say, having tried it a couple of times. So these features were okay, but not really the best. And we get into the actual meat of this update. The cargo system refactor. Now, on its own, I remember a lot of people being outraged by this because they thought that this was going to be the full loading and unloading, the whole thing that they had talked about it actually taking time. That way smaller ships actually had a chance to be more profitable because of course larger ships are going to take a lot more time to fill up their cargo, and there being different variable rates. And all this was your ability to basically take cargo off of a ship and put it onto a different ship. So this was really a piracy update, but this technology really was fundamental to getting a lot of things throughout in 3.19, 3.20. Basically every patch this year has used this cargo system refactor. So even though it may have been disappointing at the time for people who weren't pirates, it was really, I actually think this may have been one of the most important features of the entire year. I don't think a lot of people talk about it that much, but I really do, considering how much gameplay it has enabled. We got the sandbox prison activities, which were a thing. Hi, Locke from the future here to add a little bit of context. Although I don't think adding sandbox activities is a bad idea, in fact, I think prison needs more gameplay. I don't think the little bit of things that they added, which as far as I can tell is just adding a couple of different prisoners that have merits that you can get, that you can shiv them, and I think a mission to exit prison lawfully. Although I think these are necessary changes, I don't think they were really enough to give prison enough of a new feel. And I really think that prison needs more interesting and fun gameplay, reasons to go in there, people you can talk to, resources you can only find, things that you can only learn while in prison. And I think this was a really missed opportunity to add more interesting things to prison. All right, Pass Lock, take it away. We got Security Post Correa reactivation, which again was a thing. I was hoping, and I hope in the future, that this acts like a lawful player Grimhex. Basically, like you're able to go there and take high value bounties, or just a place for lawful players to actually go out and hang out and get bounty hunting gear. Oh, which reminds me, this also came with the change that the only place that you can remove your crime stat now is Security Post Correa. And I really hope they go back in the future and add security posts back to Hurston and Microtech and not Crusader and ArcCorp, because it doesn't really make sense. The only place you can remove your crime stats is Crusader. But I do want to mention, though, one cool thing about this was the first mini dynamic event. So if you go through and you kill a bunch of people and you activate the there's a little facility inside that starts spitting out contraband, similar to Jump Down. This was the first time that they added basically a dynamic event that can be triggered by the players, which I think is very smart, and I hope they do in the future. I just think it could have been a little bit more well implemented. So, new missions for Orison. These were, I think, a good idea. Basically taking the usual bunker missions and putting them on a different place, where and actually using the platforms for Siege of Orison. The problem is that because Siege of Orison kept happening, these missions kept like I can't remember the exact problem. I think they were like just not activating properly. So they actually completely disabled these until what? I think like 3.21. Well, whenever they add the additional Crusader platforms, so we'll get down to it. Overall, a good idea, but just not very well thought out, apparently. Next, we got the time trial race missions. I have to say, I'm pretty disappointed in racing. I was really hoping that racing was going to become its own profession this year, because you can make money on these depending on how fast you go. And they're actually set up on, I think, XGR's racetracks. If you don't know, XGR is a real world organization. I mean, real world, it's an organization for Star Citizen. And they set up a lot of racetracks that CIG then took inspiration from and credited them in game, which I think is extremely cool, by the way. Taking inspiration from your players, realizing, hey, the devs realizing, hey, we probably don't have as much experience as the people who are actually constantly racing, so let's just take their racetracks and then make them the actual canonical racetracks. I think that's very clever. That was very well done. The problem is, this is the only real thing they did with racing the entire year. And they were talking about like a dynamic event for racing where it sounded like it was a traditional race between players. And yeah, I was really hoping that racing was going to become its own fleshed out profession that maybe you could watch, you could spectate, you could gamble on. You know, they have that racetrack over at Grimhex. I was really hoping that was going to become open by the end of the year. And they put this in, and then it's like they forgot about racing again, which, you know, unfortunately happens to some things. You know, I'm looking at you, fueling, refueling, which was implemented and then promptly forgotten about completely. However, that does not apply to salvage. Salvage, this was the year of salvage, if anything else, because salvage is basically a complete gameplay loop, which is not true of really any other gameplay loop. Basically, every patch this year, except for me, I think like maybe one, had features that helped salvage feel like its own gameplay loop. This was very basic. This was hull stripping and repair, so basically using a beam to tear off the hull of a ship, and then you got reclaimed material. I can't remember what it stands for, but you get RMC, which you can then sell. And then, of course, we got the Drake Vulture, which is pretty cool. I actually own one of those. And of course, that goes into our ships here with the Drake Vulture. Just a last touch on hull stripping. I think it's pretty fun. It's basically like power washing. Well, I shouldn't say fun. I think sometimes when people talk about games, they only say fun. And that isn't always the emotion that a game's going for. A game doesn't always have to be just fun. Like, I think most games should be fun, don't get me wrong. But this is more like calming and relaxing and enjoyable rather than, I'd say, fun. Which sometimes after coming home from a long day, it's nice to have something calming and relaxing to do. I understand this might not be the most exciting thing to do for like streamers, right? There are some features that I'd say play well with like streamers, like FPS combat often plays well with streamers because it's exciting to watch and it's cool to do. But hull stripping, I think, is for the more casual player, even though it might be decried by some of the louder fan base who plays the game like 12 hours a day. We're going to get back to that topic in 3.22 for absolutely no reason. Anyway, moving down to Drake, we got the Drake Vulture, salvage ship, pretty cool. And then we got the RSI Antares. This is the rule of cool ship. Every once in a while, actually, unfortunately not every once in a while, we get a ship that is basically useless and not really functional, but the ship team thought it would be cool, so they made it. And that's basically this. This really highlights a problem with co-pilots not really having anything to do. There's a lot of memes about this, how you only need 2 buttons to turn on like the quantum dampener and the EMP, and it's controlled by the co-pilot. I remember there was a lot of concerns about balancing that it was going to have its turret, but instead of its turret, it basically has a quantum dampener not allowing you to jump, and then an EMP to actually disable ships, which is cool. Except that, you know, the co-pilot is the one who controls that, and they can't do anything else. Now, in the recent patch, they made it so they control missiles too, but to me, that's a pretty... I think CIG really needs to sit down and look at what can the co-pilot do. Because right now, it's not enough, and it's not fun to co-pilot a ship. And I think they really need to lean into that fantasy. They're doing, I think, a decent job of making multi-crew gameplay necessary with engineering, but I think they really need to lock down actually being fun to co-pilot a ship. So moving on, we had the salvage attachment, which can be used in place of like a vulture or reclaimer. That was okay. We got the Gen 12 renderer, which wasn't as big of a deal as some people were hyping up to be. I really remember a lot of YouTubers and streamers being like, "Oh, the Gen 12 renderer, we got part of it. I think last year." At the beginning of 2022, and it actually improved people's frames, and they were like, now that we're getting the full thing, it's going to improve performance dramatically. And the developers working on it at the time even said that's probably not the case. It's still unoptimized. This is just getting us online. And then it came into the game, and it didn't really do much, to be honest with you. So I'm looking forward to Vulcan. I'm really looking forward to this getting optimized, so hopefully we can get some better frames. And finally, last and certainly not least, persistent entity streaming. This fucking thing. This thing caused so many problems. Like I already talked about, I'm not going to go through a whole nother spiel. One of the biggest things, it was cool. My biggest experience with it was that I put like a pop can somewhere, but just by accident. I didn't mean to. And I logged in like a day later, or not even a day later, a couple of hours later. And I found that same pop can in that exact location. I thought that was super cool. I remember some streamers. There's one streamer, I think Burks, was doing a stream testing out salvage. They 30K'd. And then later, I think Zero State found their exact ship, which was super cool. Unfortunately, and this was kind of predictable, I think persistent entity streaming is basically useless right now because they've had to clamp it down they've had to clamp it down to the point that I don't think you're going to get that experience anymore, which is a bit of a shame. I think it's still around to really make sure that we can use like salvage in the cargo, but I don't think it's doing what it did before in 318 PTU, where literally I would find, like, I found an entire wreck site where someone's body was on the floor and there was like med pens around them and there was like a gun that someone had dropped and it was like exactly where they had placed it. And that was super mind blowing. But I don't think that happens anymore, unfortunately, because they've had to ramp up the cleanup on the server a lot, which makes sense. This is where I think really CIG's this idea of leaving a coffee cup and then finding it 3 months later, like Chris has always pitched. I think this has always been not very practical, and I think they quietly realize that and downsize persistent any streaming. So we'll see maybe if it expands in the future. But until now, that is what we've got. So, and one last thing during 3.18 to kind of talk about. During this time when everything was broken, they were constantly doing dynamic events. The theory at the time, and I don't know if CIG ever directly confirmed this, but the theory was that they were basically doing this so that they could test the performance and fix major bugs. So before we move on from 3.18, I pulled up the actual patch notes, which detail a couple things that aren't listed in the roadmap. We had the expansion of 30 new derelict outposts. These were pretty small things, but they added a lot of little life to the verse. A lot of missions, like delivery missions, went to them. There's a couple. I don't know if there were any clear all. I'm pretty sure basically all of these were just delivery missions, but with some Ninetales to fight against, which was pretty cool. And on top of that, I can't believe I actually forgot about this. Two things. We got the law system improvement. This has been a big thing where if you get a crime stat 1 or 2, you no longer get attacked on sight. You can now just pay it off as a fine, which is way better than the previous system where you could accidentally tap somebody and then you get a CS1 and you have to go through this whole loop of getting through prison. And it was so painful. So this was actually pretty big. And then soft death, which I don't know where that is. It's around here somewhere. Soft death. I can't believe I forgot about that. Soft death. Now, when your ship dies, instead it goes into soft death, where it doesn't explode. You can still move around it, but there's no gravity. And this is actually pretty important for the next patch in 3.19. But this was super cool. Also, like racing, criminally underutilized. There's no like boarding missions or anything that have been made for it so far. I think, again, they kind of dropped the ball a little bit on getting some content around, here it is, around soft death. So, yeah, that was everything for 3.18. 3.18.1 and 3.18.2 weren't anything significant. They were mostly just bug fixes attempting to get things better for 3.18. They also made the change where now your ships don't just spawn at your home location. You can actually request to deliver them, which is actually a pretty good quality of life, both for the server, so they don't have to load in every single ship that you own the first time you log in, which was part of the reason that 3.18 died. It's because there were so many entities it was trying to load in when people were logging in. But also it means you can go to like Microtech or something, or you can go to like Port Tressler and then spawn your ship there, which is super cool. Or spawn like your fleet there, which is super cool. So I think that was a pretty good change. But now we're moving on to 3.19. So 3.19 came out pretty much right after 3.18, only 2 months, which is actually a pretty short amount of time for a major patch. And 3.19 was a smaller but pretty significant patch. And I remember at the time, a lot of new players had started around 3.17 and watched 3.18 take like 8 months to come out. And so they were pretty reasonably expecting 3.19 to get delayed until like October. But, you know, those of us that have been around knew that 3.18 was a little unreasonable, a little bit of an exception, although CIG doesn't always get their patches out on time. Usually they don't take that long. So 3.19 came out, and they smartly kept it pretty small. Starting off with Loreville. Loreville, not a lot to say about it. It was a really cool city change. I believe it was still using the assets from Area 18 way back in the day. So it was cool to see its own distinctive flair. And then, of course, it called into question, well, what else needs a rework? You know, does Microtech need a rework? ArcCorp definitely needs a rework, but how long that's going to take. But yeah, I really liked it. It's pretty cool. I think the trams actually need a change so you can see the skyline a bit better. Moving on from there, we got the new player experience, which was not great, to be honest. It bugs out half the time, and talking to new players, I really don't think it helps. Unfortunately, Star Citizen is just at a point where so much changes all the time that creating a tutorial system is difficult, because basically what this does is it teaches you to like go out and like drink some water and eat some food and then like go to the spaceport and spawn your vehicle and then fly to the spaceport and then store your vehicle, and then it just stops. And at the very least, I think that they should teach you how to take a mission, where to find other content. Just even setting your spawn point, because I don't even think it does that. So I thought that was pretty disappointing. But at the same time, I am glad that they're at least trying to ease a new player in. Like logging in for the first time and seeing, hey, here's a 30-minute tutorial. At least players have somewhere they can start going to. Next, we got salvage contracts, which were actually really good. Um, for 318, they created these like little salvage fields out in asteroids, and they're pretty difficult to find. But 319, which is pretty short after that, actually allowed you to take contracts to salvage ships, which they've started doing something interesting, which I like, which is you basically have to pay for a contract, which I think is a very clever way of doing things. And they also added Wake of Disaster, which is probably one of the most popular missions they've added. It's basically a PvP mission, but with salvage, where there's a bunch of large ships that have died, and most of them have a really good cargo inside of them, although I think they've been nerfed in the latest patch. And then everyone can get that contract and they can all show up. And I've had a lot of fun at Wake. It's probably one of the best like dynamic missions that they've created. Not dynamic in terms of like Xenothreat, but like, missions that just spawn and everyone can go to, and PvP. Speaking of PvP, we had the Ghost Hollow PvP event, which was extremely broken at first and continuously spawned NPC black or Cutlass Blacks, which you would do the PvP event and you would look up and there would be like literally 20 Cutlass Black NPCs hovering over the downed Reclaimer, which was really funny. It was a lot of fun. A little sad that they nerfed it, but the mission itself payout I think is not really worth it as much. It's kind of fun to do. Basically, you go through into the Reclaimer, and there's 2 credit per printers. If you get both of them online and under your name, you'll get credits transferring to you quicker. And then obviously someone else can come over and transfer the credit printer to their name. And that's basically how it works. It's very simple, very elegant. I don't think it's quite worth the money to do right now, but it's fun. Hi, Future Lock here again. Just to add a little more context, when I say not worth the money, what I mean is that because the location basically tells everyone when you're doing the event, there's going to be people that come to it, meaning you're probably going to need a crew, and the amount of payout versus the time and the effort of fighting other people isn't really worth splitting among like 2, 3, 4 people. And even if there isn't other people, because there's Cutlass Blacks, you're probably still going to need at least 1 or 2 crew members, and you just don't really get paid enough to, split the profits among them. So that's what I mean when I say it doesn't really pay enough to be worth it. And then one of the other large features of this patch was, of course, the tractor beam components. Physicalized components, something they've been talking about forever, were just put into the patch, which blew a lot of people's minds. Also made a lot of people realize how few ships actually have physicalized components on them, which that's going to be a lot of fun for them to try to do engineering with. But this allowed you to like attach and detach guns, missiles, components, and actually sell them as well, which again added to salvage. We had hull scraping in 318. We have the salvage contracts in 319, plus the ability to rip off components and guns and sell those as well. So salvage is probably one of the most touched gameplay loops, especially in the shortest amount of time. I would say mining is still more complicated, but salvage has been going at like a breakneck speed. I believe at this point, technically all of the promises for salvage have been fulfilled except for transferring like fuel. Now, again, I do think salvage needs a little more complexity to it, but we'll get to that later. Moving on to the ships and vehicles, we had the RSI Lynx, where CIG continues to pretend that ground vehicles have any relevance. We had the Fury MX. I really like these two. They're basically pocket carriers. You can put them in a Caterpillar. You can put them in a Hercules. There's not a lot of gameplay for them, and I really, really hope at some point someone goes through and lets you say like refuel or rearm your, your little snub fighters from your ship, because right now there's not a lot of reason to use these. out in the field, at least for extended amount of time. I do think physicalized hangers are going to help with that. But one last big thing that for some reason isn't on the roadmap was the mining rebalance. So this is what made mining a lot more fun from what I've been told. I'm not really much of a miner, but from what I've told, this made mining feel a lot better. But with one caveat, which there isn't crafting yet, and there's nothing to do with mine goods. And so for gameplay balance, it's hard to balance things when there's only one lever, which is how much is their payout. So even though it's, I think, more fun and there's more distribution of minerals, you're still only going to go for a small selection of minerals because that's what gives you the better payout. I think the mining changes are really going to shine more when we actually get crafting or a reason to use these minerals to collect. But moving right around to 3.20. 3.20 was probably the second most disappointing patch of the year, closely behind 3.18. 3.18 at least had a lot of features. 3.20 was us waiting for about 4 months. See, the problem is because 3.19 came out so early. I mean, remember, quarters go every 3 months. You have January, February, March. 3.18 came out. Then you have April, May, and May 3.19 came out. Then you have June. Then you have July, August, September, which is when 3.20 came out. So 3.19 came out in the middle of a quarter, and then 3.20 came out at the end of quarter 3. The problem with this is that because 3.20 is so light on features, it made this wait feel like just a massive content drought. If you go back and watch the videos from that time, streamers and YouTubers are really struggling to find things to cover because at the same time, we had CitizenCon coming up in October, which we will get to, and there was basically an information blockout. So this period of time between 3.19's release and 3.20 was probably another massive rough patch of the year, which is a little crazy. We started off the year with a big rough patch, and then the middle of the year was a big rough patch, and then we have the end of the year, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But 3.20 didn't have like nothing inside of it. It did have some stuff. First off, we had Seraphim Station, which basically replaces Port Olisar. I was pretty disappointed by this because, from my understanding, the reason that they were waiting to replace Port Olisar was to give it something unique, right? Like, Port Olisar had gotten out of date ever since 3.15 added the med bays and the personalized inventory, and even before that, I think like I can't remember which patch added food, but whichever patch added food, Port Olisar started to become out of date because it didn't have any eateries. So basically, they put food in like clothing shops and stuff like that. So Port Olisar had been out of date for a long time. And I think there was a lot of talk at the time, a lot of assumptions that they were probably waiting to do something special. And then they replaced it with a generic R and R station, and I am still pretty disappointed. Now, we all complain about the development time on Star Citizen, so asking them to add unique features to every little thing is kind of counter to them getting the game done, but it felt pretty bad to have a very unique station that a lot of people loved, and in the ISC where they talked about Port Olisar, them go on about all the reasons people love it, and they go, hey, we're replacing it with a station that doesn't have any of the reasons that you love Port Olisar, was pretty bad. I really hope at some point when they have the time, they can go back and make stations be a little more unique. But at the same time, it is nice to have a port around Crusader that isn't Grim Hex that you can set your spawn at, that you can get stuff at, So it's a mixed bag. At the end of the day, I wish if they were going to make an R&R station, they would have done it just back in like 3.16 or 3.17 and not wait over a year and a half past the point that it probably should have been done. Now, there are 10 gameplay cards here, which is more than 3.18 and more than 3.19. It's more than any of these. However, all of this is for Arena Commander. And this at the time was extremely disappointing because although Arena Commander is cool, and don't get me wrong, it is cool, and we're going to talk about it, the problem is there was a very long wait for very little return. Now, we know at this point that resources at this time were being used for getting Squadron 42 feature complete. I can imagine probably getting the Pyro playtest for people late in the year, which we'll talk about, and also getting ready for CitizenCon. But at the time, obviously, we didn't know that. So we went through a big content drought, and then we got to the end of the content drought, and it's basically like, it's just Arena Commander. Star Citizen, the game you're interested in, didn't really get any updates. And it calls into question, if they weren't working on Arena Commander, what were they going to do? Because if you remove Arena Commander, you have Salvage Cover-Up, you have the Hull C, and that's basically it. Oh, and Seraphim Station. You have like 3 features for 3.20. But, all right, let's talk about Arena Commander. This was a really good update, and I am not actually salty about Arena Commander getting updated. I think some people think that, oh, if Arena Commander wasn't being worked on, then we would have got more for 3.20, and I think that's just simply not true. If we didn't have Arena Commander, we simply would have gotten nothing in return. So Arena Commander, I think, has done a really good job of allowing you to experience the game without actually always getting into the persistent universe. So if you want to practice racing, if you want to practice your dogfighting, if you want to practice FPS, as well as playing some really fun game modes. I really enjoy playing Game Rush. I really enjoy playing Gun Rush. This was a great update for Arena Commander, and I am looking forward to what they're going to do in the future. And adding things like Master Modes really helps lend credence to the fact that Arena Commander getting updated is important for Star Citizen so that we can test out experimental features in long term without putting them in the full game. And I think they're going to show that off with engineering gameplay as well, which I think was very smart. So overall, like, don't get me wrong, even though I'm saying, oh, 3.20 was a really light release, I do think Arena Commander was a really good and necessary update, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what they do in the future. One last thing, or 2 last things about this. We had the salvage contracts cover-up, which no one really cared about at the time, but oh, is it going to come up in a little bit, where basically you have to strip the hull off a ship like a hammerhead, and you got like $250,000, but it took forever to do. So unless you had a reclaimer crew, it wasn't really worth doing it at the time. And then another thing is that the Hull C, and this is another frustrating thing about 3.20, the Hull C is broken. It can barely dock, half the time its cargo doesn't load, and even since September, that hasn't changed. And I do think that this is pretty bad of CIG, especially because this was like the highlighting feature of 3.20, and then they basically rushed 3.20 out the door, which is a really weird thing to say considering it took 4 months to get to 3.20, but they rushed out the door so that we could get to 3.21. But before we get to 3.21, let's take a look at the patch notes and see if there's anything significant that I am forgetting. All right, this is Future Lock, back to the present. Everything that you just watched, I recorded before the holidays, and I just edited, and now I'm back with 3.20. The only reason I'm mentioning this is because my mics might sound a little different, so just wanted to explain that why. So, we've got 3 features left to talk about 3.20, and then we're moving on to the interesting stuff, when the year really started to get weird, strange, and interesting. Starting off with localization support, I didn't even know this was in. Apparently, you can replace your files and cause like subtitles and different text in the game to be translated to a different language, which is really cool. I hope to actually see this put in the game soon, so you can just simply click a button, but it's cool that they're starting to do that. I know that there is a big audience, a larger and larger audience growing in, like, China, for example, so it's cool to see them starting to work on that. Additionally, we had the ground vehicle handling tweaks. I do not have any thoughts about this. I literally have none. I did not drive ground vehicles before, and I did not drive ground vehicles after. The only thing that they're good for is like Atmo Esports, Daymore Rally. That's the only time people really use ground vehicles, so I have 0 thoughts. I just thought I should mention it. And finally, last is the Anvil F8C Lightning. I don't have a lot of history with this ship because I never really wanted to own one. I didn't even know much about it until this event, but basically they made it so that you could buy the ship. Previously, they've gifted the ship, I think, to like high-level concierge, which if you're new to Star Citizen, you don't know what that means. Basically, if you spend a lot of money, like over $1,000, there's different tiers of what they call concierge, and you get rewarded with different things. And higher tiers of concierge, I think like $10,000 or something around there. I'm not gonna check right this second. They gifted like an F8C Lightning. And it was described as something that you could buy as well, I believe, after completing Squadron 42, and it was commented before they wouldn't release it until Squadron 42 came out, so there's a lot of controversy around it coming out into the game proper, but it's been in the game, people have been able to steal it before, so I think that they just wanted to get it out, and also do a ship sale. But it was a different kind of ship sale, because you couldn't buy it by default. What you had to do was find a golden ticket in the game, which could spawn basically in any loot crate, and then redeem it, and then you could rent it for 24 hours, and during that time, you could also buy the F8C Lightning. Oh, I think it lasted for, sorry, I believe it lasted for a month. I don't believe it just lasted for that 24-hour period. They also did the Platinum tickets, where some developers in the game, and they weren't clear about the fact there was only some, so people murdered a lot of devs who were just logging on to test things that weren't holding a Platinum ticket. But if you killed a dev who was holding a Platinum ticket and redeemed it, you got a free LTI Anvil F8C Lightning. And if you don't know what LTI means, that basically just means you never will have to worry about insurance on the ship ever. Even though it's not a priority right now, or insurance isn't really a thing in the future, you'll never have to worry about it. So this was interesting. I don't entirely know how I feel about the event. It was very obviously a way to boost sales because they have been slumping around this time, especially because of the content drought. So it felt a bit especially because the gold tickets were extremely common. Like, they weren't hard to find. I think it would have been maybe a little more interesting to add it to specific missions like tier 3 and up bunkers or certain delivery missions, like, actually have people work towards it. And I do hope they bring this back. I think the Platinum ticket idea is really good, but I think they need to add it as a possible reward and like randomize the ship you can get. I think that could be really fun to do in game. As a fun little potential extremely rare reward, like 0.001% chance of a drop. I think that could be an interesting thing for them to do, and I would not be shocked if they bring back this event for either the FI8C Lightning or, in the future doing it for a different ship. So that is everything for 3.20. Shortly after 3.20, we received something very, very odd. We received, on a Friday, 3.21 in Wave 5 PTU. It's hard to really describe the feeling of an exciting mystery when you already know the conclusion to that mystery, but 3.21 was puzzling. You see, 3.20 originally was supposed to have more features, like the Retrieve Consignment mission, and the Steal Evidence mission, and the new Crusader platforms, but these were moved to a 3.20.x patch. And then suddenly, we were getting 3.21, not a 3.20.x patch, but 3.21, the next major patch. And it was released onto the PTU in Wave 5, which, if you don't know what the PTU is, it is basically their public testing universe, persistent testing universe, I believe is what it's actually called. And it's just a way for CIG to test out features before actually putting them to live. Wave 5 basically means anyone in the entire verse can jump in. Wave 1 is only for certain tiers of concierge and a Wave 1 subscribers. So you can subscribe for like $10 on the website every month, and then you get access to Wave 1 PTU, which is the first wave. So the first availability of a patch will be to Wave 1. So this was kind of insane, and I don't think they've really ever done this before, where they've just skipped the entire wave system and went straight to open PTU without saying anything. And this patch mostly contained everything I just talked about. Retrieve Consignment, the Steal Evidence, which we'll actually go over these in a second, as well as the new Crusader platforms. Also, and this was interesting, I wasn't really planning on talking about the wider context of Star Citizen communities, but there is a community in Star Citizen that generally leaks information. So they'll data mine things and find them. And they found a jump point. And again, if you're new to Star Citizen, jump points basically are how you get from one system to another. Right now in Star Citizen, there's only one jump point, Stanton, and we are waiting on Pyro, which is supposed to be coming with a massive patch called 4.0. Currently, we're in the 3.0 patch cycle. 4.0 is supposed to be an introduction of Pyro and the technology to actually add other systems into the game, essentially. And so the fact that the jump point was actually physically in game, you could fly to it, and the station was there, and there was a very badly rendered gas cloud around it, was super exciting. It was super. Again, now that we have more context, the mystery has faded and the excitement has faded, but it's hard to describe. But at the time, it was super thrilling, especially, like I said previously, coming off of this massive content drought where nothing was happening. Suddenly, it felt like everything was happening. We were getting 3.21, and we were getting jump points, apparently, and they talked about the reason that they were calling it 3.21 is because we were getting the replication layer. So the replication layer, again, for anyone who is new to the verse, essentially is like a middleman between our connection and the server's connection. Right now, when the server dies, we get kicked back to the main menu, and that's about it. A bunch of the data is lost. Persistent Entity Streaming's job was to save any data on those servers, so when they spun back up, they still had that data. Replication layer was supposed to save the game state itself so that a different server could connect to it and you don't get booted back to the main menu. This is one of the final puzzle pieces we need for server meshing, which basically allows us to have other systems and expand the game so there can be more players in smaller areas. Essentially, there's a lot of information on server meshing. This is a year in review video, not a I'm going to explain every single in development feature of Star Citizen. So I encourage you, if you want to learn more, CIG has videos on it and other content creators have plenty of videos on it. But just know that this was pretty exciting. There was a lot of exciting things happening at the same time. Plus, we had CitizenCon coming up. So, and I do apologize, but as we get closer to the end of the year, I am going to be adding some more context because I think it's interesting, but also the end of the year is a little stronger in my mind for obvious reasons. It happened more recently. So let's jump into the new jump point rest stop stations and Lagrange points. So Stanton, the system we currently have, has 3 jump points to Pyro, Magnus, and Terra. And we received all those jump points. And inside of them were actual stations. These stations have basically everything. They have a lot of cargo inside of them, and they have gun shops and armor shops. I think that this is an interesting thing, but at the same time, a little bit of cheeky hype here. Because a lot of people were hoping that there was going to be a big announcement that Pyro was also coming. And obviously, that didn't happen. So I think the additional locations are cool. I think seeing the jump points in-game are cool. But overall, I don't actually think this impacted the game that much. So moving on now to the retrieve consignment missions. This was like combining Korea with bunker missions. They added a item port into bunkers where you can take a mission and essentially retrieve data pads and enter codes into this box spinning out machine and get various resources as well as a mission critical item, which are confidential files. And then you could take all the resources and you can sell them, and then you had to take the confidential files to a specific location and deposit them. This is them, I think, really branching out and experimenting with taking different mission archetypes and combining them all together. So you have the item port from Jumptown and from Korea. You obviously have the normal bunker mission, and then you have delivery missions. And so they've combined all of those together into retrieve consignment. And I think it's good. It's good to have this more variety in the game, not just having to do the same kill all bunker mission over and over again, being able to do something different. Plus, in the future, we're going to talk about another variation. So that's pretty much my thoughts on it. I think it was pretty good. It was pretty cool to see. I like variation. Next, we had Korea, which is interesting. So this is one of the first missions in a while that has added content to a mission giver. And many of you might not even know there are actually mission givers in Star Citizen. They're just criminally underused. So one of them, I believe in ArcCorp, can now give you a mission to steal contraband, specific contraband from Korea. I think adding this synergy is cool, and I hope that we see more of it in the future. Because it gives the player more of a reason to go to Korea. It gives them an actual payment, and hopefully in the future, maybe more reputation and actual, maybe tangible reward. I do think that would be cool. So, moving on to ships and vehicles, we had the A1, which is the competitor to the Cutlass Black, kind of. The Spirit is a competitor to the Freelancer and the Cutlass. The A1, however, is specifically a bomber variation. It doesn't have cargo boxes and all that, so it was fine. I mean, if you want something different than, a Cutlass or for Freelancer, and also the ability to bomb people, then there you go. Have at it. Next, we finally got the new Crusader platforms. I talked about this earlier in the video about in 3.18, they added missions to the Crusader platforms for Siege of Orison and then had to disable them. Now they've actually added like resorts around Crusader, which is cool. And that is where you can get like repel, clear all, assassinate, etc. So like I said before, I like the idea of setting these missions somewhere else than just bunkers, so good for me. I don't really have anything else. They did more ground vehicle physics update. Again, I literally have nothing to say about this. And so, this concludes the first part of 3.21. We do obviously have more than this, and that's the reason that we're actually covering it in patch news instead of not the roadmap, because the roadmap combines 3.21 and 3.21.1, which both have significant features in them. But in between there was the largest event Star Citizen has ever had. CitizenCon 2023. Going into October, I was anxious, and a lot of the community was anxious. We've had, up to this point, frankly, a really bad year. We had 3.18 being unplayable. We had 3.20 taking basically 4 months with pretty much no news. But recently, we just had a glimmer of hope. And so CitizenCon really needed to do 3 things. It needed to talk about server meshing, a fundamental technology to the game working in the future, allowing us to visit other systems and actually becoming an MMO. It needed to talk about Squadron 42, the single-player game that CIG is also, making at the same time, and many people felt was taking too many resources from Star Citizen. And it needed to do both of those things, as well as show confidence in the project, because confidence was at a pretty low point. And somehow, some way, CitizenCon did all 3 things excellently. Now, I'm not going to recap everything that happened at CitizenCon, because it would take me probably double the length of this video to really recap everything. But we're going to quickly go through the exciting parts. In first, the future of Star Engine, where we learned about server meshing. There's a lot more shit that happened in that, but server meshing was the biggest thing of them showing it actually working for the first time ever. And the amount of excitement I felt over the live stream, and I could feel it. I could feel the excitement in that room even over the live stream, and I really wish I was there. It was palpable. And there was so much other cool stuff. Maelstrom. There's obviously the new cloth physics. Okay, I said cloth physics because it just came to mind. That's not really that exciting. But there's the new water effects. Their new lens effects for rifles and stuff like that. Plus that big 18-minute long or 18 to 20-minute long video showing off everything that the Star Engine can be capable of doing. You've probably seen many people react to it. It's has 2 million views at this point on YouTube, so go watch it if you haven't already. They talked about engineering gameplay. They talked about some new ships, which isn't that exciting. But the other big thing at the end of the first day was really talking about the star map, talking about the mobiGlas, talking about the UI, because UI and navigation around Star Citizen has been one of the biggest pain points for a lot of people for a very long time. It's hard to figure out how anything works, and when half of your UI doesn't work, most of the time, it becomes even more difficult to figure out how Star Citizen works. So what this first day did is it talked about server meshing, it showed it working, and it showed the developers really... There's a difference between a marketing team looking at something and showing it off in the best possible way. And I'm sure part of that happened here, but it was clear that the developers, the people actually working on the game, got to talk about the things that they were working on. And we got to see them actually in action, which is different than, you know, a cinematic or here's a concept of how we think it'll work. A lot of this stuff, which had been worked on for Squadron 42, like the UI, was very polished. And that was one of the things that they had talked about for a long time, is that yes, they were diverting resources from Star Citizen to Squadron 42, but that would mean that the features that Star Citizen got back from that would be a lot more polished. And obviously, up to this point, we never really got any features from Squadron 42, so we couldn't verify that, and people were understandably getting upset. But this day, the first day, really blew everyone's minds away, and everything looked really good. Well, engineering still looks pretty far off, but anyway. The second day came around, and I think was really good. Not quite as good as the first day, but it showed off a lot of other stuff that they didn't get to cover in the first one, like actually adding a tier system to armor, adding actual new functionality like flight suits and armor to wear if you want to be a medic, that kind of thing. Adding a lot of improvements to FPS combat, not just shooting, but also looting, something that the game really needs. Better interaction systems, because the interaction system is really bad and kind of clunky right now, and also talking about locations and cooler and better locations. But, of course, the biggest thing they revealed at the very end, well, the second biggest thing, is that they are going to be working on base building and crafting, showing off a really cool video about the concept, and they did clarify and say it was a concept, and that it was going to start being worked on in 2024. When I was watching this video with a friend, I kept saying, fuck off, to be blunt, because I refused to give in to the hype. And then they ended the show, and they announced Squadron 42 was feature complete. Basically meaning that all the features have been done. Now, the only thing left to do was polishing, and as we got confirmed later, most of the teams will be moving back from Squadron 42 to Star Citizen to bring everything that we saw over the past 2 days to us. There are very few times in a project, whether it be anything, a movie, a TV show, a book, writing, I don't know, a game, where you can point to a specific moment where everything changed. And to be clear, because I know if someone reacts to this, they're going to roll their eyes and being like, we don't even know. And you're right. We don't know if they're going to actually be able to pull everything off. But if they do, if they bring everything that they showed off within the next 12 months, next year in 2024, this CitizenCon, I think, can be pointed to as the moment that everything changed. Because the content drought was over and we were flooded with content. And it wasn't even finished because at CitizenCon, people who attended got to play in Pyro, the next major system. And not only that, we at home soon were going to be able to play in Pyro in something new called the Tech Preview Channel. Basically a way for them to test new tech and new content without fully pushing it out to the PTU and going through the wave cycle and releasing it on live. There was a lot, and it was exhausting and exhilarating to watch. But, of course, not all good things can last, and eventually we had to come back to reality and move on to 3.21.1. Before talking about 3.21.1, we have to talk about the Pyro playtest. So, as I mentioned before, during CitizenCon, some of the attendees were allowed to play in Pyro, and then later they opened it up to some backers, which I was fortunate enough to play, to actually play in Pyro. It was on the 3.21 branch. There wasn't anything new. I did hear that it at CitizenCon there was some of the new water and some of the new NPCs and features they had, but none of that was in the actual playtest that we got at home. And Pyro, my first impressions is that it is a lot of fun. Being spawning straight on the space stations, they feel so immersive. I love them so much more than any of the cities right now, except for maybe Microtech because it's my favorite place, and I guess Orison. I guess I still like the cities of Stanton, but there is something spectacular about the ruined, abandoned places. And I just love the openness of Pyro. The fact that, you don't really go into any bunkers. Everything's at settlements and outposts, and some of them are large, some of them are small, and they're owned by different factions, and you can see those factions. And it just felt awesome. And I cannot wait for Pyro. And also the solar flares were super fun. I remember during the game, I was with a bunch of friends and we were kind of having a bit of PvP against this other faction, and we were having to avoid the solar flare because if we went up too high, it literally would give us a warning and flash our ships. Unfortunately, one of my friends actually got driven into the solar flare and got just exploded, which was just amazing. It was really awesome. It felt different. The experience of just being able to do missions in different locations really does make things feel different. But of course, it was new, so of course it was fun, right? Like eventually it would get boring playing in Pyro like it gets boring playing in Stanton. But this being a taste of what Pyro is and what it can be, I'm really excited to finally get the system in full, hopefully at a later time, which we'll talk about at the end of the video. But so I just wanted to talk about that before we moved on to 3.21.1. So 3.21.1 reminds me in some ways of 3.19 because it's not a major patch. There aren't a massive amount of features, but the features that are added actually are pretty significant. The first one, I'm going to be honest, I never think about because I never have to deal with it, but they added a trespass system where when other people board your ship, you're allowed to kill them without a crime, and also apparently that if they board your ship and then you chase them into their ship, you're still allowed to kill them, which is an interesting choice. Basically, it's just making it, so that you can hold your ground and you don't get charged for defending your own ship, which is a good thing. Next, we got a new mission, the Data Heist mission. It continues the theme of the Retrieve Consignment mission of adding different variation to the bunkers. This one is an all unlawful one, so I haven't played it too much. And my honest reaction when I watched the ISC of this video, which is basically you hack into a terminal and then the owners try to shut down the terminal by basically destroying the servers. And you have to go around the bunker to the different screens, finding the passcode to input into the computer so that you can turn off this shutdown and help keep the servers cool so they don't overheat and die, and so that, your hacker friend, who's the actual one doing the hacking, can finish the mission. And when I first saw this mission, I thought it was really dumb. I hate to say, I really did. When I first saw this mission on ISC, I was like, what are they doing? Like, of all the things they could be doing right now, why is it this? And after playing it, I actually think it's a lot of fun. Similar to the Retrieve Consignment, there is a wave-based system. So they're just going to keep throwing waves at you, so that's fun. But also, the fact of the matter is that you have to move around the bunker because there are different screens placed all over the bunker with the code that you need to disable them destroying the server and failing the mission. At first, in the early missions, they spawn a marker telling you where that is, but the later missions, which are harder, actually don't. So you have to find it yourself, going through this bunker, which is spawning more and more NPCs that are becoming, harder and harder to kill. And I actually love this mission now. I think it's very well designed. So I guess that's my lesson to not always judge things as harshly immediately. So moving on from that, we're going to skip vehicles for a second because we are going to talk about something else. Tractor beams. So ever since they were added, handheld tractor beams, they really changed our interaction with Verse. It allowed us to move boxes, it allowed us to move bodies, like it allowed us to interact with things a lot easier without them having to add a lot of fidelity to our hand. Like, instead of us having to go up to a component and grab it with our hands and yank it out, which would require a bunch of animation time and a bunch of bug fixing for that to feel good, we can just use our tractor beams. And at any time in the future, they can go back in and they can just add the animations for us doing that. It's like as much as I know people complain about Beam Citizen, adding beams I think is actually the better thing to do right now, because later if they want to add something more complex, they don't have a bunch of gameplay they need to get removed. It's just a beam, you know? So, like, if they want to add a bunch of fidelity to us removing objects, they don't have a bunch of animations they got to throw out. They just got to add them, because the only way we're doing it right now is with beams. But, anyway, sorry. Tangent and rant over about Beam Citizen. I'm sure I'll get some salty comments about it if you make it this far. So, vehicle tractor beams actually adds the tractor beams to various vehicles, hence the name. So, like the Cutlass Black, that is actually the only ship I know that adds the... there are more ships than that. That's just the only one I know. Oh, the Crusader Spirit gets it. And then, of course, the SRV, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Oh, and also to the Vulture. And my thoughts about this is that they're really, really bad. Not really. Like, they've gotten more uses as time went on, but this was definitely a feature that was obviously rushed out the door, because their first implementation was not that useful. It was kind of janky, and even on some of the vehicles, they don't really make any sense. So, like, for example, the Cutlass Black has a tractor beam on the back of its cargo bay. So you would think you would use that tractor beam to pull boxes into the ship. Except you can't aim the tractor beam on the Cutlass Black into the ship. Meaning the best you can do is, like, pull a box to the ramp and then get out of the seat controlling the tractor beam and then manually pull the box all the way into the Cutlass Black. It doesn't make any sense, and I genuinely, most of the times I understand things have their reasons for being the way they are, and I can kind of understand them. I do not understand how any single person used this tractor beam on the Cutlass Black and some of the other ships and went, yep, this is good to use. This passes, our testing. Like, how? All right, but the actual big thing that people were really excited about was the SRV, the ability to tow disabled ships. And this gives a lot of potential future gameplay for repair, and also for salvage. It also completely broke something, which I'll come back to in a second. So that was basically vehicle tractor beams, and that was the SRV. It allows you to tow vehicles, which is pretty cool. There was also a lot of miscommunication. I've been noticing this is happening a little more, where one developer said that you can use the SRV to pull a broken ship to a pad and have it be repaired, and then the actual person working on that feature said, no, that's not actually it. So, CIG, I think, definitely needs to work on their communication between the devs a little better, because them saying you could do that was released on, like, an official polished episode, and then them saying actually that's not in was on, like, a Star Citizen Live, a live stream that they do almost every week, which not as many people are going to watch. They also made it so that, like, Wake of Disaster, which is a mission I mentioned in 319, those can't be towed because they feel like it would break the experience. They also moved the new player experience to New Babbage instead of ArcCorp, which, I mean, I have the same thoughts on it I did earlier in the video. It's not a great new player experience, but it's better. And something I don't think I mentioned then is that they also update a lot of the signage to be more readable and to teach you to use signs. And I do think that that's pretty good. They also rebalance a lot of the ship cargo manifests that spawn in, like, salvage missions. So earlier I mentioned that they had nerfed Wake of Disaster, and they nerfed some of the salvage contracts you could get. You could make bank off of them, and so they nerfed them. They also completely and utterly broke a salvage mission, but again, we will get back to that. They also made it so that headlights are actually usable now. One of the biggest complaints about the game is that fighting or playing in the dark is unbearable, and the ship headlights were a joke. And so they've actually massively improved them. They're a lot better now, which is good to see. But I feel like some of the gameplay teams do not understand why people keep asking for night vision. People are not asking for night vision because they want them in an FPS combat. I mean, they do, but they're asking for night vision so that we can actually see and play the game while in the dark. Because trying to fight ships while in pitch black is just not fun at all. All right, so now it's finally time to talk about, and we're going to talk about it even more in the next patch, something that I've been hinting about through the video. Illegal cover-up missions. We briefly talked about them when they came in online in 3.20, which is basically you go through and you hull scrape them, and it takes a while, and you get some money from it, and then when you complete the mission, you get a big chunk of money. So there's hammerheads that spawn, and constellations that spawn. And if you complete the hammerhead job, you get 250,000 AUEC, which is a lot, but obviously a hammerhead is a massive ship, so it's going to take a while to actually, completely remove the hull on the hammerhead. Same thing with the constellation, but that's 80,000. In 3.21.1, they added, because I think they realized that the SRV literally has zero gameplay right now, the ability to instead tow the ship outside of a certain range, and then that would complete the mission with no penalty. So in essence, what CIG did, because they did this in the middle of IAE as well, which allows you to rent basically any ship in the game. It's a free fly that happens every year. So anyone could go and rent the SRV when they learn of this, is take an illegal mission, which does give you a crime stat, but the fine is like 30,000 AUC. It's not bad. And then you can spend 3 minutes, literally 3 to 5 minutes, towing the hammerhead, and then immediately make 250,000 AUEC. I'm going to leave my full thoughts about this until we get to 3.22, but this is a problem, and we'll get back to it. So besides the SRV, they also added the C1 Spirit and the Temporal Storm. The C1 Spirit is, like I said earlier, basically the competitor to the Cutlass Black. It's someone's daily driver. It can do a lot of different things. It can store vehicles, it can fight, it can store a decent amount of cargo, and it's not that expensive. And then they also added the Temporal Storm, continuing CIG's tradition of pretending that anyone cares about ground vehicles and they have any relevance in this game whatsoever. I am also going to talk about ground vehicles a little more extensively in the next patch because that's our final ground vehicle. Let's move on to 3.22. One thing I want to interject real quick in here before we get to 3.22. They also added the Sulin, which is an alien starter ship at IAE. Looks super cool, not very practical, probably not a good choice for a new player, but it's really awesome. The Cutter Scout, this is them once again putting the cart in front of the horse and releasing a ship that has gameplay that doesn't exist. Scanning does not exist in Star Citizen beyond the very basic pinging system we have. And although I'm glad that they have the basics thought about, that really needed to be added first because right now there is no reason to buy a Drake Cutter Scout. All right, back to the clean roadmap. So 3.22 is technically not considered released by the roadmap, even though it is, and we'll talk about why at the end. So 3.22 came out, I believe, about 2 weeks ago in December. It was pushed out so that they could get a final holiday update, and there was some cool stuff and some controversial stuff. But starting off with the player hair update, at CitizenCon, they showed some better player customization, and that included a much-needed hair overhaul. And I think that it's really nice. Yep, that's about all I got to say about that. I mean, it's really good. I don't have anything negative to say. There's some really nice hairstyles now. Before, there was really a lot of bad ones, and they improved that. So, moving on. We have the new derelict settlements. Now, these are not the same outposts that we have in Pyro. I've seen some people try to make that comparison, but they have been working on this since, I think the start of the year. And I don't think these are really related. These are supposed to be outposts specific to Stanton, where you have some more old ruins, or maybe someone crash land and created a nice little settlement. There's some really cool ones, like an oil rig. These most of them have the new Duster faction, who mostly, from my understanding, do mining piracy, but they are considered neutral right now, so you can actually go there, you can buy things, you can trade things at them. There are also missions to kill the Dusters, which is also super cool. So there's a bunch of new content, which is awesome, because sometimes CIG adds new locations like the sand caves, like the rivers, and there's nothing really to do at them, and it's like, well, that's cool. Got nothing to say all about them. These derelict settlements also have a massive performance problem. I believe they said they fixed it. I haven't had time to test it myself. But basically what was happening is that when you got close to the derelict settlements, your game would tank to like 5 FPS. And it was happening to everybody, whether you had a good computer or not. So hoping that's fixed. Haven't really heard a lot about it. But yeah, pretty cool overall. We're going to skip this for right now. We're going to come back to it. Cargo containers. Actually, something very funny about these happened recently. These are not what I thought they were. So if you look at it, it looks like you're actually storing things in cargo containers. And they mentioned that at CitizenCon as well, that eventually they're going to add cargo containers that could contain like smaller cargo containers, or like you could actually pack away a vehicle inside of it. And that's what I thought this was. And it's not. And that's fine, actually, because what it is it allows you to purchase a cargo container, place it down on your ship, and then actually store, like, you know, weapons and armor inside of it, which is really good for looting bunkers. So, you know, or even organizing your stuff. So, you know, I don't mind it, but overall, I did think it was something a little different. We also got some Arena Commander updates. So now when you're playing different modes, you can actually spawn together in a ship. Previously, if you wanted to do like a mission with a hammerhead in Arena Commander, one person would have to spawn a hammerhead, and then everyone would have to spawn in their separate ships, and then you have to fly over and get in the turrets, and yeah, it was just a whole mess. Now you can just simply spawn in the hammerhead and the different turrets just right off the bat. There's also a bunch of new maps. I believe there's a new experimental mode, Gun Rush, which was a previous experimental mode where when you killed someone, your weapon got upgraded, became a permanent mode, which is really cool because it's probably one of the most fun things they came up with. And then going down to ships and vehicles, we got the Santok Yai, which I have heard is another kind of rule of cool ship. I've heard a lot of mixed things about this ship. I've heard it's good, I've heard it's bad, I've heard everything. It looks cool, it has a cool animation, it's an alien ship, so I'm glad that it got added. And then we had the Origin X1s. We're also going to come back to this later. This instructional salvage has a rant coming. And finally, we have the replication layer. This is why it is technically considered tentative, is because the replication layer has not actually come out yet. So, structural salvage. This was, I think, a mistake by CIG. Although I understand what they were trying to do, structural salvage as it is right now breaks the game because it's way too simple and way too profitable. Basically, what it allows you to do is look at a ship and fracture it, like you can do a rock in mining. It splits it apart, and then you can go into disintegration mode and disintegrate those pieces and get construction materials, which you can sell. So you can completely disassemble a ship and sell construction materials. Now, RMC is still worth, I think, twice the amount of construction components, but considering how quick it is to get construction components, in my opinion, it's still like more time efficient, especially with the Reclaimer, which is a much larger ship, to just devour a couple of ships, go back to port, sell it, go back out, devour a couple of ships, go back to port, you know. And the problem with this is that it has completely destroyed any real reason to do other missions. It's so easy to do, there's no risk, there's no skill, there's no time involved in to do it, and it has such a massive reward that it overshadows everything. And hey, remember that illegal cover-up mission I mentioned in 3.21 that got broken by the SRV? Well, it was also broken by this feature, because now you don't need to spend 3 to 5 minutes towing the hammerhead out. You need to spend 1 minute disintegrating it with a reclaimer, and then you just get 250,000 AUEC. This is a problem that CIG is going to run into more and more, and I think we're going to see happen more and more as time goes on. Sandbox games, by their very nature, are supposed to allow you to do a lot within them. Sometimes things the developers don't come up with. That's what makes a sandbox game good. The problem is that certain things that certain teams are working on get completely destroyed, overshadowed, or broken by future features that come out shortly thereafter. I mean, this feature came out 3 months after 3.20, which is when we got the illegal cover up, right? Yep. And the SRV only came out a month later. Or no, I think it came out 2 months later. Yeah, it came out 2 months later in November, even though it says October here. So in just 2 to 3 months, this mission, which was pretty simple, pretty generic, no one was really paying attention to it, was suddenly completely broken and removed any reason to do anything else in the game. And this is going to keep happening because Star Citizen is a massive sandbox game. And as they keep developing systems, not every person is going to consider every single possibility. And I do hope in the coming years, CIG does do a better job of creating a team of people who can help manage this aspect of the game. Because, like it or not, it's a sandbox game. And these elements fitting together need to happen. And it's a difficult job. And Star Citizen is one of the most complex games out there. But this is the game that CIG wants to make, and if this is the level of detail and fidelity that they want to have, then they're going to have to take everything that comes with and really try and plan these features out better in the future. Okay, one rant done. Second rant, these fucking things. Ground vehicles. I do not understand CIG's obsession with creating ground vehicles. They do not have a point in the game. They just straight up don't. They don't have a point. The only thing that they are good for is for used in some events like Jumptown, which allows you to go to a specific location and make a bunch of money. And so you can use things like ballistas and the Centurion, which has, a massive laser gun on it, and you can park those, as well as the Nova tank, I suppose, and now the Tumbrel Storm AA, and you can park those at the Jumptown and use that to defend it. But that's not a ground vehicle. That's not them actually being used as ground vehicles. You're just using them as a turret. You might as well just add base building in and allow me to place a turret down around Jumptown, and that basically has the same effect. There is no reason, as of right now, to ever use a hover bike. They are so unreliable that in the video where they were showing them off, the only place they were showing them was on the Microtech frozen lake, which is completely flat with no bumps, no hills, no trees. Most of Star Citizen's terrain does not support ground vehicles and does not support hover bikes. And I was really hoping with the ground vehicle improvements in 3.20 that this would be fixed, but it's pretty clear it's not. So I really would like to see CIG justify ground vehicles in the future. I mean, they talked about the Tumbrel Storm as a scout tank, but there's nothing for it to scout. And even if there was, there's no reason not to use a different vehicle to scout. Okay, so that's my rant about structural salvage, and that is my rant about the ground vehicles. We have covered everything from 318 to 322. So that means there's only one more thing to talk about. 2024. So this has been a long video so far. Not the longest video ever made, obviously, but still, we've covered a lot of topics from 318 to CitizenCon to Pyro, all the way to 3.22, and a couple of rants that I included at the end of the year. So let's cap everything off with a prediction. CIG announced most of the features that they think they're going to get in the first 6 months. That is master modes, persistent hangars, freight elevators and freight kiosks, FPS improvements, EVA Tier 2, visor lens update, loot screens, interaction system, shopping missions app, the character customizer, the Moby-Glass, the star map, the distribution centers, and 6+ ships. That is a lot. That is a fucking lot. But I don't think it's as ridiculous as some people are acting. Because here's the thing, I think sometimes people have a bad habit of either positively or negatively mystifying CIG, making them almost a mystical force. And at the end of the day, they're a company with people. And the things that they try and make, generally, if the company or the people working on it have the resources to make it, and it's within the tech that the game engine can handle, they're going to make it. Because although there are many times where things have been delayed or things they've said are going to come out don't, there have been plenty of other times where they've said that something's going to come out and it does. The thing is, something I noticed last year is when a new studio called Montreal was opening up, or not really opening up, but was getting more highlighted and there was more gameplay coming out of them, a lot of people were praising them because most of the stuff that we were seeing was very quickly getting put in the game. And they were being compared and going, oh, anything Montreal makes comparatively to the other studios just immediately gets in. And I think that the big difference is that Montreal, as far as I can see, was mostly just dedicated to Star Citizen. And everything they were working on, like the derelict outposts, were within the scope of the engine. Taking something else like salvage gameplay, which had been promised for years, I mean, up until this year, 3.18 with persistent entity streaming seemed necessary to even let Rex stay spawned in. So although they promised salvage over years, it seems like it wasn't even possible to do until this year. And so although I know that this is a lot, and obviously a lot of people are very skeptical because CIG has never outputted this much at once, I think it's worth remembering that a lot of resources have been siphoned to Squadron 42, and those resources are now back on Star Citizen. B, we saw basically everything at CitizenCon working in-engine at the very least. And C, I think CIG is going to make this a mandate. They're going to make it so that teams don't get pulled off and prioritize into other things. Because that's something else that can often happen. Sometimes when they're trying to work on one thing, they get moved and pulled to something else. That happens a lot. In fact, different developers can talk about it. They've talked about it in live streams. I think they've even talked about it in ISCs before and monthly reports of a team getting pulled from one feature to another. I think CIG is going to do their best to make sure the teams keep working on these features and have the people they need. And because of that, I actually think we are going to see most of these features next year, the first 6 months. But I actually want to go through them and talk about the ones and just make my prediction now. That way I can rewatch this video at the end of the year, next year, and see how much I was correct about. So I'm even going to do something risky. I'm going to do something that I'm going to take a little more pride in, which is predicting if it's going to come or not. And then I'm going to try to predict the quarter. I'm not going to take it seriously predicting the quarter because it's almost, I feel like, impossible. Starting off with master modes, I think this is the likeliest to fall off because there's so much that needs to be done. And if it does come into the game, it'll come in quarter 2 with a rollout to different ships, which is probably going to go really badly. Next, we have persistent hangars, which are separate from freight elevators. I think that this, again, probably could be quarter 2. It just depends because we know that in order to create persistent hangars, they want to create instancing, where when you get into your hangar, you are instanced instead of it being in one of like 10 hangars. And because that's new technology, it really just depends on how far along they are on that new technology in the first place. So if they're pretty far along, I could see quarter 2, but I'm gonna stick with quarter 2 and potentially quarter 1 for freight elevators and freight kiosks, unless they decide to pair the freight elevators, freight kiosks with persistent hangars, in which case both will come in quarter 2. FPS improvements, quarter 1. I doubt that these are going to take that much longer. EVA tier 2, this is a hard one because we've not seen it in a while. I'm going to be bold and say quarter 1, but it just depends on how, like, what state EVA is in right now. Visor lens system, loot screen, and interaction system, all I'm predicting Q1 and are coming. Shopping mission apps, I'm predicting Q2 because they just started production. Character customizer, I'm also going to predict Q2 because I think that there's a lot of Star Citizen specific iconography that needs to be added to it. And Jared specifically said that we're going to be talking to the person making it probably in March. And March is right around when the Q1 patch should be out. So we probably would hear from him earlier if it was coming in the Q1 patch. But I could be wrong. We could also be hearing from him because he's the last person. So you know what? Actually, I just changed my mind. I'm changing it to Q1 because I think that Jared is going to talk to him. I can't remember the developer's name. Basically on one of the last ISCs before the batch comes out. Mobiglass Star Map. Star Map Q1, Mobiglass Q2, because Mobiglass still needs to actually be made. They specifically said that the Mobiglass that we saw was for Squadron 42, and they have to make one for Star Citizen. So that's my prediction. Star Map could slip to Q2, I think, if there's still a lot of gameplay that needs to be added to it, like actually rooting. But that's my prediction. Distribution centers, Q2. If they come in Q1, I'm going to say right now they're not going to have a lot of functionality and they're going to be very bare bones. Because from what we saw in CitizenCon, they are still in gray box, which is not final art, which is the final stage. If they were in final art, then I'd say Q1, but I think they still have a while to go. My question here, I don't think raids are coming with them. I'm happy to be wrong with that. And then finally, 6+ ships. Probably going to be split between Q1 and Q2. Just my prediction. So that's everything. I think most likely to slip master modes, persistent hangars, and distribution centers. Everything else is basically UI and things that I think are pretty easy to tweak. I also wouldn't be surprised if FPS scanning comes later as well, because that requires more time for them to actually sizzle or actually like balance for the persistent universe. So Pyro 2024, I do not believe. I straight up do not believe. And it all comes down to what I have open right here, the replication layer. And the replication layer is starting to remind me of 318 in not a good way. 318 started as something that they predicted getting out at like Q3 of 2022. And then it kept getting pushed back. And it kept getting pushed back until Q3 is when we got the PTU, and we didn't get 318 until Q1. And the problem is that it worked at small scale, but not large scale. And it took them many patches to resolve all the issues. And I'm starting to get the same feeling from the replication layer. Originally, 3.21 was called 3.21 and not 3.20.1, because it was supposed to have the replication layer split. And now, suddenly, it's been pushed back to 3.22. And it's going okay, but it is pretty frequently dying and crashing when we have a lot of people on the playtest, because there are playtests going on for the replication layer. And it's just reminding me a lot of PES, where PES did not scale. And I fear that Q1 next year, they're going to try to push the replication layer update, and it's going to go terribly. So if if 3.23 ends up being the patch that the replication layer gets pushed to, because they want to have a stable patch and then add the replication layer to it. That's why they waited for 3.20 to come out, and then they're going to add the replication layer, because the only difference between live and PTU is just the replication layer, and that's it. And so for that reason, if replication layer comes out in like January, February, and it's good, and it doesn't destroy live, then I think we have a fair shot of Pyro 2024 summer. If it doesn't, then I think we'll see it at the end of the year. And I know it's a meme to say it's at the end of the year, but I do actually think we will see it in 2024. God, I hope that this clip is not being used in one of my future videos as a womp womp womp. All right, for future me, if you do have to use that clip, you do have to use that womp womp womp. Sorry, that's part of the rules. All right. thank you everyone for watching this end of the year analysis. It was more of an informal talk. I hope you enjoyed it. If you like it, subscribe. If you really liked it, go ahead and follow me on Twitch. I'm going to start probably doing some more live streams and doing some more stuff like that. I want to really get more Star Citizen content out in 2024. So have a great few days left of 2023, or have a great 2024 whenever you're watching this.